Now let me add one more section, a zoom into Enoch's vision of the heavenly house of fire and ice, to strengthen the gate/guardian language and check the count. Right now, soldiers are standing on a mountain the Bible never fully explains. Mount Hermon, 2,814 meters. The highest peak in the entire Levant, visible from 100 kilometers away, its limestone cracked with sinkholes that swallow rivers whole. A text kept out of most Bibles says 200 beings landed on this exact summit before the flood, and swore an oath they're never to break their plan. The mainstream explanation calls it myth. But the mountain still carries the name of that oath. The summit is still occupied, still restricted, still fought over. And the text has not changed. Start with the place, right now, because the place is not a metaphor. Mount Hermon sits at the meeting point of three borders, and right now, this year, it is under military occupation. Snowcats crawl a ridge that soldiers are ordered to hold through the winter. Radar dishes turn above frozen rock, nearly 3,000 meters into thin air. This is not ancient history, this is current news. And that alone should bother you, because 2,000 years before any of these armies existed, a forbidden religious text pointed at this exact peak and said, "This is where it happened." The text is called the Book of Enoch. It is not in your Bible. It was excluded from the mainstream Jewish and Christian canon, kept alive in full in only one isolated tradition on the far edge of the ancient world. And yet, when archaeologists opened the caves at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, they found something nobody expected. Not one fragment, not two. Multiple independent Aramaic manuscripts in multiple different handwritings spread across multiple caves. 11 manuscripts of Enoch itself, 9 or 10 more of a companion text called the Book of Giants. A work so closely tied to Enoch that some scholars believe it once belonged to the same book. A text supposedly unnecessary to faith was copied like scripture by more than one scribe across more than one generation at the same desert site. That is the first problem. Excluded texts do not usually get this kind of attention. You do not carefully preserve, in multiple handwritings, across multiple caves, a document nobody thought mattered. Something about this book made an entire desert community keep returning to it, and something about it made later authorities want it gone. Early Christian writers actually treat Enoch as authoritative. A line from it is quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, naming Enoch by name and repeating his prophecy of coming judgment word for word. Another New Testament letter, 2 Peter, leans on the same story without naming the source, describing angels who sinned being cast down and held in chains of darkness until judgment. Then, within a few centuries, most of the church quietly stopped copying the source text itself, even while its language kept surviving, half-hidden, inside books that did make the final cut. A book good enough to quote as scripture, then abandoned hard enough to nearly vanish outside one African tradition. That is not how you treat a story you think is harmless. Now open it, chapter 6, and notice immediately that it does not read like a sermon. It reads like a report. Beings called the Watchers looked down and saw human women and wanted them. Their leader, named Semjaza, was afraid to act alone, so he proposed something specific, an oath, a pact. 200 of them agreed to bind themselves to it, together, so none of them could quietly back out. Then comes the line that should stop you cold. They descended, in the days of a man named Jared, onto the summit of Mount Hermon. And they named the mountain Hermon, the text says, because that is where they swore themselves to the plan. Read that again, slowly. This is not a floating vision of heaven. This is a head count, a leader, a location, a date marker tied to a named ancestor. Myths do not usually specify how many showed up and whose watch it happened on. Field reports do. And here is where the ground starts to move under the metaphor. Hermon's own name is built from a Hebrew word, cherem. It means a ban, a thing devoted to destruction, an irreversible oath. The mountain is not just the setting of the story. According to the text, the mountain's name is the confession. The oath did not simply happen near Hermon. The oath is why it is called Hermon at all. You can call that a folk etymology, and scholars genuinely argue over how literal that derivation truly is. That is a real, open debate, and it deserves to stay open. But notice what does not need debate. The toponym and the myth have stayed fused together for over 2,000 years, across translations, across empires, without anyone quietly separating the two. If this was only poetry, it is strange how stubbornly the poetry survived attached to a real coordinate on a real map. Before we go back to the mountain, deal with the obvious objection, because scholars raise it constantly. Who exactly are these sons of God in Genesis? 3 readings compete. Some read them as human royal tyrants. Some read them as the line of Seth marrying outside their line. And the oldest reading, the one the Qumran community itself clearly held, going by which text they bothered to copy and preserve, treats them as literal divine beings, angelic figures, who physically crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. That is the debated part, and it is genuinely debated. But notice which reading the earliest interpreters, closest in time and language to the original text, actually chose. Not metaphor, descent. So we go back to the mountain, because the mountain keeps giving up more than it should. Mount Hermon is not ordinary rock. It is Jurassic limestone, karst terrain, the kind of stone that dissolves from the inside. Sinkholes, solution channels, underground conduits carrying entire rivers beneath the surface, the Dan, the Banias, the Hasbani vanishing into rock and reappearing miles away as some of the largest springs in the region. Because of its height, the summit captures far more snow and rain than anywhere else nearby, water that simply disappears into the mountain before it ever reaches open air again. The mountain is, physically, hollow in more places than any single map fully accounts for. Ordinary geology, yes. Nobody is claiming a hidden chamber waits under the snow. But ask yourself why ancient tradition, after ancient tradition, keeps placing imprisoned, dangerous, half-divine beings near exactly this kind of terrain: cracked stone, underground voids, water disappearing into darkness. Later in the same text, when the punishment finally arrives, it is not vague either. One of the watchers, Azazel, is bound, thrown into a desert location, the text names Dudale, and buried under sharp rocks, in total darkness, until judgment. Bound, buried, named location. Again, not the language of a dream. That is not proof, that is a pattern. And patterns are what should worry you here. Zoom out for a moment, because the terrain around Hermon has always attracted this kind of story, not only in Enoch. In the region right below its slopes, the biblical tradition places Bashan, the territory of Og, described as the last remnant of an older giant people, the Rephaim. His bed, the text says, was made of iron, 9 cubits long, kept on display long after his death as physical proof to anyone who doubted the size of what had once lived there. You do not have to accept every measurement in that account to notice the pattern repeating. Giants, again, clustered around the same mountain range, generations after the flood, was supposed to have erased them completely. If the Nephilim story was a one-time myth, it is strange how the same geography kept producing the same kind of report across different books, different centuries, different authors who likely never read each other. Now zoom in on one more physical object, because this is where the case file stops being only textual. Near the summit, explorers recovered a limestone stele, Roman era. Known as the Kasser Antar stone, found in the ruins of a small sanctuary near the peak one of several temple remains scattered across Hermon's slopes, the kind of structures that made the early church historian Eusebius describe the entire mountain as a place still respected as sacred ground by the nations around it, centuries after the events it supposedly witnessed. The stele itself carries a Greek inscription, and the inscription is an oath formula, a line invoking, in its own words, the greatest and holy God, addressed to those who take an oath at that place. One prominent Enoch scholar, George Nicholsburg, noted that this exact divine title echoes a phrase used repeatedly throughout the Book of Enoch itself, the Great Holy One. Be careful here, because this is exactly where a lesser story would lie to you. The connection between this stone and the Watcher's oath is not proven. It is disputed. Some scholars call the link linguistically vague, more supposition than evidence. That caution is fair, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But sit with the coincidence anyway. A stone that talks about swearing an oath, standing on the one mountain whose entire name means oath, inscribed with a divine title that shows up again and again in the one forbidden book that names this mountain as the landing site. You do not need the connection to be certain for it to be uncomfortable. There is one more word worth stopping on, because it involves a translation choice most readers never notice. 2 Peter, describing the same fallen angels, uses a Greek verb found nowhere else in the entire New Testament, tartarosas, cast into Tartarus, not a vague word for hell. the actual name of the Greek underworld prison built to hold rebellious gods. Most English Bibles quietly translate it as simply hell, smoothing over the fact that the original author reached for a specific piece of pagan underworld geography to describe where these particular beings were held. One writer, describing the Herman story from a different angle, in a different language, still could not resist naming an actual place to contain them. The softened translation erases that choice. The Greek does not. Later chapters of the same book describe Enoch himself approaching a structure guarded by fire, walled in flame, floored in ice, with beings stationed at its entrance who do not let him pass without terror, the ground beneath it described as trembling. Whatever else that vision is, it is not soft. It is built out of heat, cold, walls, and a threshold. Gate language. Boundary language. The same physical grammar the descent scene uses, applied again to describe something meant to feel real enough to frighten the person seeing it. And uncomfortable is exactly where this story needs to go next, because we haven't even reached the part the title promised you. What actually came down from that summit? The text does not stop at the oath. It follows the consequence. The watchers took human wives. Something was born. The text calls them Nephilim, and the Hebrew root behind that word is nephal, to fall. Not a name that describes a size, a name that describes a category error. Genesis gives you exactly 4 verses on this. Sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim, mighty men of old, men of renown. 4 verses, and then silence, as if the writer assumed you already knew the rest. The book of Enoch assumes nothing. It fills in what Genesis leaves out, and what it describes does not fit cleanly into any category we have. Not fully angelic. Not fully human. Not animal. The text says these beings consumed everything humans grew, then turned on humans directly, then, when nothing else remained, turned on each other. When they were finally destroyed, their bodies ended, but something did not end. Their spirits, the text says, survived the destruction of their bodies, and continued to move through the world as disembodied entities. Stop and actually register what that is. That is not a warning about pride, dressed up as a monster story. That is a procedural account. Diet, then escalation, then extinction, then a description of what physically happens to whatever was left when the body was gone. Symbolic warnings about sin do not usually specify what a creature ate before it started eating people. This reads like an incident report on a species that does not fit any known shelf. Match no known species is not a marketing phrase here. It is what the oldest layer of the text is actually claiming. The companion text found at Qumran, the Book of Giants, goes further still. It gives some of these offspring actual names, Ohia, Hahia, Mawe, and follows them through dreams they cannot interpret, sending them back to Enoch himself for judgment on what is coming. A myth meant only to warn against pride does not usually bother naming its monsters and giving them personalities. A record does. Now bring it back. Every one of these threads returns to the same coordinate. The summit, the oath, the name, the stone. The desert prison built for the ringleader. The consequence born from the plan. And here is the twist most people never get told. The version of this story that survives complete only exists in one place, translated far from its origin. The original Aramaic is fragmentary, torn exactly where the account is most dramatic, missing whole stretches at the edges of the most disturbing chapters. What we have in full comes from Ethiopic, Ge'ez, the far end of a long chain Aramaic into Greek, Greek into Ethiopic, each link losing something of the original. The most heavily copied text at its point of origin is, ironically, the hardest version for most people today to actually read in full. The clearest surviving account of what supposedly happened on that mountain is buried at the end of a translation chain most readers will never follow, in a language most Bible readers have never opened, sitting today behind glass and academic commentary rather than on any shelf beside Genesis. Which means the strongest claim in the whole story survives, essentially, by accident of geography and preservation, and it survives anyway. Multiple, scribal hands. Multiple caves. Multiple centuries. A text this uncomfortable should have quietly disappeared the way most rejected literature does. It did not. Someone kept choosing to copy the most dangerous chapter, over and over, long after the mainstream tradition decided it did not need it. So let's put the entire case file on the table at once, because this is the part where the pressure should be at its highest. A named summit, a specific head count, A named leader. An etymology fused into the mountain's identity for 2,000 years. A geology built from hollow stone and vanishing water. A named desert prison for the ringleader. A gate and guardian vision built from fire and ice elsewhere in the same book. Named offspring, with personalities. Dreaming dreams they cannot interpret. A neighboring region still carrying its own giant tradition generations later. A physical stele on that same summit carrying oath language and a divine title that echoes the forbidden text. A separate New Testament author reaching for the literal name of an underworld prison to describe the same event. A description of the resulting being so specific it reads like a report, not a parable. And a modern military occupying that exact peak, right now, refusing to leave it, the same way the text says something once refused to leave the plan sworn on it. One of those details alone is coincidence. 2. Maybe folklore. But this many converging on the same physical coordinate is not how metaphor is supposed to behave. A purely symbolic story does not usually need this much overlapping, verifiable geography just to make its point. Now, the honest disclaimer, because you deserve one, and because it does not weaken anything that came before it, no physical evidence of Nephilim, no bones, no remains, has ever been recovered on or near Mount Hermon. None. The Qasr-Antar connection remains unproven, and probably unprovable with what currently exists. Mainstream scholarship treats the whole account as ancient symbolic literature, a dramatic elaboration built on 4 sparse verses in Genesis. That reading is allowed to stand. Nobody has to abandon it. But notice what the disclaimer does not do. It does not explain the head count. It does not explain the etymology. It does not explain why armies are still standing on that specific summit, while a text nobody was supposed to keep reading still calls it the Mountain of the Oath. The caution is honest. It is just not complete. Go back to the passage one more time, now that you know what you're actually reading. Not a vision drifting somewhere in the clouds, a location, a date tied to a named ancestor, a head count, a leader. A verb descended that points down, onto rock, onto a summit you could walk to today, if the checkpoints allowed it. The text does not float. It lands. And it lands in the same coordinates a modern army is currently defending with radar and snow gear, for reasons it would tell you are purely strategic, and nothing more. Consider how long this particular ridge has been fought over. Israeli forces took part of it in 1967, during the Six-Day War. Syria tried to retake it in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, and lost it again. A United Nations buffer force has manned the summit since 1974, the longest continuously held peacekeeping post at altitude anywhere in the world, soldiers rotating through some of the harshest weather any UN mission has ever assigned. And in December of 2024, after Syria's government collapsed overnight, Israeli troops moved onto the Syrian side of that same summit and stayed, calling it a temporary security measure that, months later, still has no announced end date. Every one of those decisions was made for radar range, water sources, and sightlines into 3 countries. Nobody making those decisions was thinking about Genesis. And yet the coordinates keep lining up with a story written down before any of these borders existed. The mountain has not moved in the 2,000 years since that text was copied into a cave near the Dead Sea. Its name has not changed. The oath word is still buried inside it every time someone says Hermon out loud. Soldiers are on that ridge tonight, watching 3 borders, guarding a peak that a banned religious text once described as the exact spot where something crossed a line it swore never to uncross. Nobody has proven a doorway waits under that snow. Nobody has proven the stone is the same oath. What remains is simpler and colder than proof. The passage still says what it says, unchanged, in the same tense it has always used. The mountain still stands exactly where the text put it, unmoved by any of the arguments made about it. Every winter, the snow returns to the same summit, covering the same rock, over the same hollow ground, above the same vanished water. And the summit, tonight, is still closed.